Several years ago, there was a very powerful movie titled The Elephant Man. It was the story of a man in 19th century England who suffered from a horrible skin disease. His head had swollen up to a very large size and was greatly enlarged and deformed. His skin was grossly wrinkled and had the appearance of almost elephant-like skin. From childhood on until he was in his early 20s, he was treated horribly. He was looked at as a freak, and forcefully, he was made to work in a sideshow for a traveling circus, where people paid to go in and look at him. He was considered an idiot until doctors eventually discovered that he was not mentally challenged at all. He was actually quite literate and was well read and had a great ear and appreciation for music. He was finally, in his 20s, able to escape the circus, and when he was in public, he would cover his head with a piece of sackcloth because he didn't look very well in the eyes of people. But one day, his appearance with the sackcloth over his head terrified a small child. The child began to scream and to yell and was afraid of the man. So angry people chased the man down and they ripped off the sack off his head. Then someone in the crowd asked, "What is that? What is that?" And he replied, "I am a human being. I am a human being." How terribly painful it must have been for him to be stripped of his human dignity, that he had to tell people over and over again, "I am a human being." What we heard narrated in the first reading was how in ancient times, people with disease of leprosy were to be treated. There was a whole set of laws and regulations. They were, first of all, isolated from society, forced to live outside the towns, not to be with their families, to live in group settings where they would be able to be with themselves and away from the community and their families. And they had to cry out when they walked. If they did leave to go for a purchase or something, they had to cry. Some of them even had a bell to ring, and they cried out, "Unclean, unclean." Like the elephant man, they were stripped of all human dignity. Can you even imagine the shock of the people in the gospel when the leper approached Jesus and Jesus reached out to touch him? Jesus broke the rules. You weren't supposed to go near, much less touch a leper. But even more, what about the reaction of the leper? How long had it been since another human being had touched him? How long had it been that he had experienced the isolation of having no warm, affirming human relationships, longing to be touched or embraced by another human being? What overpowering feelings must have welled up inside of him when he felt another human, Jesus, touching him? When Jesus broke the law, and he did, and reached out to this man who was disfigured and repulsive looking, an outcast of society, Jesus was equivalently saying to him, "Even though you have been degraded and treated as something less than human, I am saying to you now, you are a human being." Although in our day today, our modern society, we don't see physical leprosy in a widespread way. There's cases of it around the world. but so much more treatable. But there's a lot of emotional deprivation that went along with it is still very much with us in our world today. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Molokai, that refuge for lepers that was established in an island of Molokai in Hawaii. And it was really an emotional visit. One thing that I noticed immediately was how isolated it was. In order to get there, and that time that I went, we had to take mules and go down this road that was just alongside of the mountain. It was just a small little trail, back and forth, back and forth. It took almost 2 hours to get down to the bottom where the refuge was. And I thought to myself, that was so deliberate, because there was just really a cliff. And it was very difficult for any human being, much less, an animal to go and try to get up there. And in those days when the leprosy was so brutal, they had guards at the top. And if anyone who was even guessed to be a leper, they were immediately shot because they didn't want them to spread the disease. They also lived along the water in the ocean there, and the boats wouldn't come in all the way. There was no docks. And they wouldn't come in, and so what they'd do is when they got close to the shoreline, they'd throw the food and the other kinds of supplies over the boats, and the lepers had to get in small little rowboats and try to save and bring the food in. Much sunk, and many of the lepers passed away because they couldn't swim very well. And it was total isolation. They were away from the community. And Father Damien, who was famous as the leper priest, was on the island, and as a priest, he desired very much once in a while to go to reconciliation, to go to confession. One day he heard that the bishop was coming on a boat, and the bishop refused to come to the shore. He was frightened. And so Damien rowed out in a boat, stood beneath the boat with the bishop hanging over, and he had to humbly yell out his sins so that all could hear and be forgiven by the bishop. It was total isolation. It was totally a terrible situation, misunderstood, of course, in that day. There are many people who don't have a close relationship with anybody in our world today, too. We might call them the elephant people of our time. They may be the aging parent whose children never come by to see them and visit them. It might be the senior citizen abandoned in a nursing home with no one to visit. It might be the mentally ill, misunderstood, the AIDS victim, the bullied child at school that has no one to share his plight or her plight. It might be the undocumented immigrant, the stereotyped Muslim, or the physically challenged individual left out of all activities and sits by the side. There is no easy solution for the inner pain that many people experience in their lives, whether it is the leprosy of emotional deprivation or the suffering of those discriminated or stereotyped by an intolerant society. Jesus reached out his hand and touched. We can all stretch out our hands and our arms with compassion and touch someone's life in a deeper, more honest, and more enriching ways. That's what the Lord challenges us to do when he reached out and touched the leper in today's gospel. He challenged all of us to reach more deeply inside ourselves, to touch the deepest, purest humanity within us, and to have the courage to raise up even the most rejected person with the message they so long to hear. You are a human being, a child of God, my brother or sister.